everyone today to our HR's Homework post-election webinar that is being facilitated by HR Recruit and Vista Employer Services. My name is Jo Thompson and I'm a consultant for HR Recruit. I'm joined today by the team at Vista who will introduce themselves shortly. They're going to share their insights and knowledge following the recent election and help you to prepare your organisation. If you do have any burning questions during the session, then please put them into the chat box facility and we will cover them as we go along. I'm now going to hand you over to Vista, who will introduce themselves and start the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo. Well, starting at the top, I'm Stephen Foster. I head up the employment law team here at Vista, and I'm joined today by some of the team, and I'll hand over to Jennifer to introduce herself.
Thank you very much. My name is Jennifer Winship. I am one of the employment lawyers at Vista, and I'm really pleased to be here with you today. What we're going to do is just give you a quick run through here of what we will be speaking to you about today. So the first thing first is, why are we here? What's happened? Well, as you will all know, the Labour manifesto was issued with what's been called the biggest employment rights shake-up in a generation. We were all eagerly awaiting the King's speech last week, which has certainly given us some more detail, but also given us quite a lot of questions and things to consider. We need to look at, firstly, the Employment Rights Bill. This is the bill that Labour had promised to introduce within the first 100 days. We have had some more detail about that, and Stephen and I have discussed this and picked out really areas where we think there may be challenge for your business. Then we need to look at the Draft Equality, Race and Disability Bill, which we have also been promised. We'll look a little bit about timescales. When is this all going to happen? And then we'll move on to look at some top tips. So we're going to look firstly at the Employment Rights Bill. And Stephen and I have picked out at the top there what we think is going to be one of the greatest changes for you. And that is going to be the introduction of employment rights from day one. So Stephen, do you want to give us a little bit more information and insight on that?
Yes, thanks, Jennifer. There's been a lot of hype in terms of this 100 days that Labour expected to bring everything in. I think the first thing to say is, in terms of the timescales, the 100 days is the legislative timetable, and you would have seen the King's speech. We're not actually sure when the 100 days runs for, whether it's from the election date or whether it's from the King's speech, but I think what you can expect to see is by about October, you will start seeing some of the detail in terms of the two main bills that we've got, the first being the Employment Rights Bill and the second being the Equality Bill. So day one rights, this is something that will be important to a lot of employers, and we've just picked out a few of the highlights here. But the very first one, I think, is the day one right not to be unfairly dismissed. There's two things to say about this. First and foremost, there's always been a wavering on terms of timescale for unfair dismissal claims. The older and more experienced amongst us will know that it was changed from 1 year to 2 years. When I saw that this was being reduced to a day one right, I was wondering whether this was going to be a consultative or a negotiation position in terms of getting it down to 6 months or back to the year. But actually, at the moment, it looks like it's going to go down to 1 year. That in itself wouldn't take the government too long to introduce. They could introduce that fairly quickly. And for employers, the impact of that is you can probably see an increase in grievances being raised so that people can bring those claims, and then in turn you may see an increase in the tribunals. If that was to happen later this year, then that increase would be noticeable towards the end of this year, and the tribunals would then reflect that in 2025. I've said all of that because there is, as you can see from the slide, reference to a probationary period being a new fair reason for dismissal. Now, if that is the basis of the government's changing legislation, then, as the government said with all of these matters, they will be consulting with employers and trade unions on this. And that will require a legislative change as well to change one of the fair reasons for dismissal. And that may push that change further down the road. So I think it could be a quick win if they just wish to rely on employees and the usual probationary periods. Then I think that would be a quick win. We have to wait to see what the bill says in terms of the probationary period. In terms of exploitative 0 hours contracts, this has been a hot topic, I would say, for the best part of my 20 years career. And we worked a lot with people on 0 hours when I was with a national organisation. And what I would say about this is 0 hours if they are good contracts, are preferred by a number of those people on 0 hours that want the casual work as much as the employers wanting the flexibility. So the key word here to identify is exploitative. That has not been defined as such as yet, but what it's likely to mean is where there's a one-sided bargaining position and somebody doesn't have control in terms of the terms, the amount of work, and the changes which they're looking to bring in is a bit more certainty. The key changes there are, if somebody is working regular hours, then they can have those put into a normal contract. That may be quite difficult because the whole nature of zero hours contracts is the flexibility. So we'll have to see how that comes in. But ultimately, I think this is going to be a big area of consultation with the employers and the businesses, because it's the flexibility of the workforce that's going to help the growth, which is the primary driver for a lot of the changes which Labour wish to bring in. Fire and rehire. Well, we've just had the legislation last week on this, and they're already looking to change that. So as of the 18th of July, you will be aware that there's a code of practice already come into effect through the Conservative government, which has put into a number of steps that employers must follow if they are looking to fire and rehire. In simple terms, for those that are not familiar with that term, you'll remember the P&O Ferries incident where a lot of employers were just dismissed and so forth. That caused a lot of political fallout. But fire and rehire is where you're looking to change terms and conditions. You can't gain consent and you look to dismiss and re-engage them on the new terms. I think this is going to be a big area of consultation with employers, and whether they get the changes in of banning it, which is what Labour want to do, we'll have to wait and see. I think that if that does come into effect, what you'll see is lots of businesses looking at making redundancies and closing the businesses rather than fire and rehire. So whether it has the benefits for the workforce, I don't know, but it's certainly been a major part of the government's manifesto. So we'll have to see how that plays out in terms of consultation with the unions and the employers. Flexible working and sick pay. Flexible working, we're all familiar with the flexible working. In terms of the reasons, we're not seeing any changes as to the reasons you can reject that, but the idea is that there'll be a default position of you should grant the flexible working. It will be a day one right, and the idea is that, again, that will be eventually for all workers. And I keep mentioning workers in terms of day one rights, in terms of the unfair dismissal and the flexible working. I think initially this will come in terms of unfair dismissal for employees, and they may then extend that to workers. The reason why I mention that is another major part of the manifesto is that the government is looking at condensing the three categories of workers at the moment, which is employees, workers and self-employed, down to two categories, i.e. workers and self-employed. But that's going to take a lot longer to come in, and I think the government will be keen to get these day one rights in for employees as soon as possible. So in terms of the flexible working, that's fine. In terms of flexible working, I don't see a significant change. I still think that there'll be certain businesses and certain sectors where the flexible working will still be governed by those business reasons. But we'll just have to be prepared that people can make that application as a day one right. Sick pay, again, slightly misleading in the manifesto. It was saying it's a day one right. Sick pay is a day one right already. What's changing primarily is the lower limit of earnings and also the waiting days. So it could be a significant change, something for employers to plan for, because again, I think that can be brought in fairly quickly. But you'll just need to make sure your HR systems, etc., are ready to cope with that change. Creation of a fair work agency. This has been, again, something that's been a hot topic for many, many governments where they want a single enforcement body. I think this is one of those things that will depend primarily on the growth that's achieved by Labour. The reason why I say that is there's no detail on how that will be financed. And at the moment, the public purse doesn't have the money necessarily to spend. And therefore, whilst this might be something that they wish to achieve and the enforcement of employees' rights and workers' rights, I think this is something the government might put further down the road. New rights for unions. I would say this is potentially one of the big areas for employers. The main thing is access to workplace, the gig employees and self-employed. Access to workplace at the moment, you'll be aware on the news of Amazon trying to secure union trying to secure recognition with Amazon, and Amazon are pushing back quite hard. The government are obviously supported by the unions, and something the unions have been pressing for and supporting Labour is to gain greater access to the workforce. So it will be subject to reasonable notice. The plan is to allow the unions to come on site and gain membership and work with the workforce. I think another big change will be that we saw the Conservatives trying to manage the ability of industrial unions to secure industrial action. A lot of those changes are going to be reversed. So this, again, could be a big area for change for various employers. And worker status, I've already mentioned that, but I think that's much further down the road. I think that's going to take a lot of consultation. The legislation and so forth is going to be significant in terms of changes. So again, that's one to watch out for. So those are the key areas that we wanted to highlight for you. We will deal with questions. But this takes us to the second main bill, which is the draft equality and race and disability. This applies already in terms of gender to employers that have 250 employees or more. So we are familiar with the structure of this, and it will be extended to those of ethnic minorities and those with disabilities. The aim is still the same. The aim is to close the pay gap, and that's always a good thing. But I think, again, although we've got legislation in place for the gender reporting and equal pay, it is a complex area of law. So I think there will be a lot of consultation with employers and unions. I think it will take time to get this through Parliament, slightly longer than the employment bill. And therefore, I think this is one that we just need to watch this space. But it is something that employers can prepare for, which is something that we will be coming on to towards the end of this. But as you can see, it's not straightforward in terms of ethnicity. You can see mixed heritage and assumptions about backgrounds. Lots of businesses haven't collected this data to date. So I think there's a lot of preparation, and I think we're looking further into this Parliament, if not the second Parliament, for those changes. Jennifer, next slide.
Oh, yeah, that's great. Here we go. Thanks, Stephen. So I just want to talk a little bit about timescales, and to help inform me regarding that, I was having a look at the explanatory note, which has been issued along with the guidance for the King's Speech. And there's a couple of things of interest within that, just in terms of what Stephen has discussed. And the first thing is in terms of fire and rehire. It seems from the language that it isn't going to be an outright ban. It's going to look at making sanctions potentially for fire and hire more punitive in many circumstances. So essentially to try and encourage people not to use it, but it doesn't look like it's going to be an outright ban, which was quite interesting. Because I think that takes us to how long is it going to take to actually implement this? We've been offered or told that this is going to, the employment bill is going to come in the first 100 days. The first question is that going to be from the date of the election or the date of the King's Speech? We haven't been told. But what was interesting in the King's Speech and also in the explanatory note is there's a lot of grey areas. There's going to require to be consultation. Also, if we look at the right of access that unions will have to the workplace. When we had the big speech by Angela Rayner at the Trade Union Congress, we were told that this would be an absolute right. We can now see when we look at the explanatory note that this has been watered down, and they're talking about reasonable access. So there is going to have to require to be consultation around this, and the 100-day period looks very tight. The Employment Rights Bill, this will need to go through both houses of Parliament. Most thoughts on the ground amongst employment lawyers and employment barristers is, again, this is going to need a lot of consultation around who is going to be covered, who's going to be protected if we look at disability. Who will the comparators be? Will it be another employee with a different disability? Will it be an able-bodied employee? We haven't been told, so we don't know. And again, there's going to need to be a lot of consultation around that. The day one unfair dismissal rights, well, that's going to need a new ACAS code to be consulted on at a bare minimum. So as Stephen said, we're really looking at September 2025, probably by the time this is done and actually implemented. The Equality, Race and Disability Bill, as we've just said, that's going to be a draft bill. And again, it's going to need extensive consultation and content and enforcement. And I wouldn't be surprised if we saw guidance from ACAS, which again is going to cause further delay while that is all consulted on. So that is good and helpful, because it does mean that it looked initially that the things would be brought in very, very quickly, but it does look like that may not be the case. But as Stephen said, I think and agree that something that will come in and be seen as a quick win early is a reduction in time to claim unfair dismissal, and potentially the reason for unfair dismissal, the reasons for that, that's something that can be changed very quickly. So in terms of top tips, what can you do to get prepared within your business? Well, the critical thing is to keep up to date, to make sure that you're signed up to updates. There's a lot of updates around, everybody's interested in providing information. What I would say is that the information that we are providing at this stage is being constantly updated. So it's probably good to pick 1 or 2 sources to get your information from, because you will see as it is updated, it will be clearer to keep on track of it if you're just using 1 or 2 sources and you're able to essentially piece all of that together. There is a bit of a danger that there might almost be too much information out there. The other point that we wanted to cover off is that employment law in Northern Ireland is actually devolved. So the Northern Ireland Assembly will be making their own decisions as to any reforms. So if you have any part of your business that's in Northern Ireland, you need to make sure that that is essentially scoped out separately and you're taking separate advice regarding that. You need to ensure that your managers are trained to manage performance from day one of employment, and you need to review your probationary clauses and processes. Now, that's also going to come into play in terms of sick pay as well, but particularly if we are going to have to rely on probationary clauses, then it's going to be very, very important that there is good, clear performance management from day one, so that we are clear as to why we're dismissing employees and that managers are fully engaged with this. So it would be worth getting that training in place now. That can only be helpful across the business as a whole. So we would really, really encourage you to do that. Prioritise structural change now. Now, the reason we have said that is that we have also been advised that collective consultation provisions may be changed, and instead of being able to use individual locations when we're looking at numbers for triggering collective consultation, we may have to look across the wider business. Now, that is obviously going to be very challenging, particularly if you have a large business that essentially operates as maybe smaller mini businesses, and they are used to handling redundancies themselves, and they've always done that discreetly. So again, you need to start thinking about how will we collate this data, how will we keep on top of it, how will we analyse it, and if you do have any big change programmes coming up, it would be worth having a think about whether these need to be commenced now, and making sure that any decision makers are aware that the collective consultation provisions for redundancy could well be changed. Also consider how you will report on pay. Stephen talked about this in terms of the Equality Bill. Again, very worthwhile getting this in place now. Issues that have come up already is, if you're going to have comparators, if you only have 1 person doing that job, you may have that individual coming to you saying, I know it's anonymised, but everybody's going to know that's my salary because I'm the only person carrying out that role. So we have to think about that, think about how you will communicate with employees if these new obligations come in, how you will speak to them, how you will update them, how you will answer any queries that they may have. The final thing that we would strongly encourage you to do is prepare to review your collective agreements, and also for union engagement, because it's clear that the union are going to have influence here. They are going to be drivers here. I suspect that they will be putting a lot of pressure on the government in terms of the right of access to the workplace. As I've said, the explanatory note is only talking about reasonable access. I think they're going to want to push that up, that test of reasonableness, because of course, if they can get into the union, if they can get in, to the workplace, if they're able to recruit, then that is obviously their raison d'etre. And obviously in terms of their finances, that's something they really want to be doing. So be prepared to review your collective agreements, and also to speak to your unions about this, so you're engaging with them. You may want to engage with them first and start driving the process if we think there's going to be changes, rather than waiting for them to come to you. So have a think about that. Many clients we work with have quite old collective agreements. That's perfectly normal, but they haven't been updated or reviewed in some time. Sometimes not very clear on what the provisions of these are. So it's worth getting them out and going through them again and getting any advice that you feel that you might need about that whilst you've still got time to do that.
Could we just go back one slide there, Jennifer? I
course.
just want to make on the union side, on the union side of things, something that sprung to mind as you were talking is the recognition of unions, as we've seen with Amazon, is something that will be driven. So the process is through CAC, CAC it's commonly referred to. If you've not got a workforce agreement, or you've not got union recognition, start talking to peers that you know in the sector. See who the unions that have the sector knowledge that you're in, and also where they have a good working relationship. What you'd rather do is control the unions and think about that. Doesn't mean you need to implement that now, but you can start surveying the market and see who you'd like to be working with if that was to come to your door. Far better that you control that recognition if that bridge or the door is opened on that, and you're working with somebody that is easy to work with, rather than somebody coming in and pushing their way in and being awkward. So I think in terms of unions, that's probably one of the big things, the recognition. I think that may also be an area where Labour will be keen to keep the unions happy. So we will see a lot of the industrial relations law that was introduced in the last 2 or 3 years being reversed. The other quick thing that I think is worth mentioning that we've just before we go to questions is national minimum wage. Some of you might have seen that there will be a change in national minimum wage. We are familiar with that, but there is a proposal that they'll remove the current age bandings or categories. So they'll make that one. That makes perfect sense to me. If you're doing the work and they're talking about equality, if you're doing the same work, you should receive the same pay. So just be aware. We need to see the detail on that, but be prepared for that. I think that's something that wouldn't take too much to change. That could be in. I think we might see the proposals in the employment bill this October, and it could be in by April next year. So start thinking about how your workforce, the number of people that are on that minimum wage and the age categories there. So just a few specifics there that I would suggest is worth taking into account and preparing. And as Jennifer mentioned, this equal pay audit, if you go back to the title of those 2 bills, they've actually named the equal pay one a draft. To me, they've recognised in saying that this is a draft is that they recognise this is going to take a long time to bring in, and it will be consultative process. So therefore, I think out of the 2, focus on the employment bill, the day one rights, etc. And I think you prepare now for the pay gap, because as we saw when it came on the agenda, a lot of system changes need to be looked at. Make sure the systems are capable. Can you collate that data? If you don't, are you going to start planning to collect that data and start preparing for any reports if you are over 250 employees? Because the trick here is, how are you going to explain those gaps? And how are you going to manage those gaps? And if you can do that before the legislation kicks in and becomes compulsory to report, you've now got a year or 2, I would say, to start preparing. And that's a project that you can be working on without the pressure. Sorry, Jennifer, I went on a bit there, but I think it might be useful.
No problem. So we're going to take some questions, but just before we do, I just want to hop onto the last slide to say that if you have any questions after the event, or if you want to get in touch with Stephen or I, we have an email address that's going to come out in a follow-up email to you. It's info@vista-online.co.uk. So please feel free to email us. Anything, if you just mark in the title that you've attended this presentation, then we'll be able to easily find that, and either Stephen or I will come back to you. So if we just go back now to any questions, Jo, I'll hand back to you, because I think you're manning the chat there.
Yeah, there's quite a few bits and pieces. Just bear with me a second. I'll just go back to the beginning. So the first one is, where does the flexible working from day one differ from the recent statistic changes to the flexible working in April this year?
I think what it is that what they're trying to do is they're opening that up to all workers, not just employees, is their intention. And I think it's just a constant drive from those changes earlier in the year. So it's just a day one right. and it will be, the intention is to open it up to all workers, not just employees.
Okay. So Lorraine's asked, how will probationary periods need to be adapted to ensure dismissal day one rights are not interpreted?
That's a really good question. What we think the government is thinking about is whether there'll be changes to the contractual provisions that employers can put in so that you can operate that review of any new workers and new starters. So I think what we may see is the detail from the government, but I think what we'll see from companies is that they will extend those probationary periods and they will need to be reviewed in the contractual terms. In terms of practice, actually, I think it's a good prompt for all businesses that you should be using the probationary periods. Often we have a probationary period issues come up and we're talking 6 months, 12 months down the road when it should have been picked up and dealt with in the probationary period. So in practice, I think two changes. One, we may see companies extending contractual probationary periods. And two, I think we need to ensure that we train managers and the probationary period is actually managed actively rather than we think about it only if we suddenly want to dismiss somebody and we're looking to see whether they've got 2 years or if they're in their probation period.
Okay, thank you. So Victoria's asked, do we have any guidance on the change to collective consultation, including global matrix restructures, or just those impacted in UK, but covering all UK locations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we really don't have any clear guidance on this at the moment. I suspect that they will only be looking at locations within the UK. However, that said, there has been some unhelpful TUPE cases which have developed across the piece that have looked at when there's been outsourcing to parts of the business out with the UK. So I'm hoping that it's going to be made clear that we would only be looking at UK locations when we're collating and counting up, but we don't know. And separately, what I would say is that any legislation is always subject to challenge by lawyers. So it will be interesting to see how that develops, because it wouldn't be surprising to me if there was an attempt to try and challenge this if the legislation is not explicitly clear.
Okay, thank you. So Samantha said for unions, is that based on a certain level of employees?
I think that would be a practical way forward. I think that we already see in the legislation that there are exclusions in terms of TUPE consultations and redundancies. So I think that's very, very likely, but we don't know the detail. I think that's highly likely.
We've also been asked, will minimum wage changes affect apprentice wages?
I don't know. In terms of apprenticeships, the government are looking at the apprenticeship levy and they're bringing in a new structure, which I think is the Skills England. So I think that we'll see the detail on that and whether that's included or not. So I think we'll need to see what Skills England's details are first.
Leslie's asked if you can talk more about the right to switch off, and when you see this coming into force, will it be a recommendation?
Sorry, Stephen. Yeah, sorry. I think this is going to be a really interesting one, because I was discussing this with some other employment lawyers, and I would include myself within this, that in terms of the right to switch off, for those of us who perhaps have younger children, it actually might suit us to work in the evening. We want to do that because we might want to do a pick-off or a drop-off, a pick-up or a drop-off at school. So I think what is probably going to happen is it's going to end up being a bit like the working time regulations, where there will be opt-in or opt-out. Now, one thing though I would say that we're going to have to highlight to managers is we are going to have to be careful, I think, when we're looking at promotions, when we're looking at opportunities. If we do have individuals who have opted out, we're going to have to be careful, I think, that there isn't a detriment to them in terms of, say, career opportunities. If there is, we're going to have to be clear as to why that is, so we can justify that to a tribunal. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done around that, because interestingly, across the piece, I would say, when I'm looking at, online social media, Twitter, things like that, this is probably the piece of legislation, proposed legislation, that actually a lot of people are least keen on, because they're kind of seeing it as a way to take away flexibility from them. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that develops.
I think that's right, and I think the thing with flexible working is it's not the flexible working or the breaches of or the right to switch off. It's to the point Jennifer's just made. The real claims, if you're working on the claimant side of the fence, is to try and get a claim in for direct or indirect discrimination. So I think if the right comes in, the big claims, and the thing to watch out is general policies or inadvertent practices which are creeping in because of people's attitudes towards that. But we've seen the legislation. This is something I think the unions are driving more than the public. I think this is something which we're seeing come across with the working groups in Europe, in Belgium and France, and I think the unions here are pushing something. So I think that's being driven onto the government's agenda. But a bit like 0 hours, there are always bad practices out there, but the majority of people in terms of working time, flexible working, it's normally the good employers that are normally compliant, and it shouldn't be anything to worry about.
Thank you. Peter's asked, who would be considered a worker as opposed to employee?
That's a very good question, and it would basically be anybody who isn't deemed to be genuinely self-employed. They want to just move back the government to just having everyone who's not genuinely self-employed lumped in as workers. Now, I think this is going to be really interesting because there are issues, as everybody knows, with what HMRC deems to be genuinely self-employed individuals, with who actually are self-employed from an employment perspective or who may not be employees. Now, the HMRC guidance is not necessarily something that a tribunal will take on as something that will instruct them in their decision making. But I can see a lot of issues arising with regards to this, because if we look at, say, the medical and dental professions, you have a lot of dentists who are not practice owners, who are self-employed associates. They're deemed to be self-employed by HMRC. But when you actually look at it from an employment perspective, there's a real argument that some of these, particularly very junior dentists who perhaps work for, big practices, there's a lot of control there. They're probably would deem to be workers at a bare minimum, possibly employees. They could well be lumped as workers into this, but they genuinely don't want to be, because they would rather keep their self-employed status. It works better for them. So I think there could be a lot of people who are dragged into this who actually genuinely don't want to be. And I know that it's something that accountants are a bit concerned about, and they're looking at what will HMRC do? Are they going to update their guidance on the back of this? Because I think it's been presented as this is a good thing. It's a bit like the switch off. This is great. You will all want to do this. We are giving you something that's really good by the government. But there's a lot of nuance, as we all know, in employment law and people's individual employment law situations and their status, etc. So it's not necessarily, I think, something that everybody's going to want to be dragged along into.
I think this is going to take time, a long time, and I don't think it's something to worry about just yet. I think just taking agency workers, for example, they'll be the worker, but what happens if the end user decides to dismiss? Does that individual sue the end user for unfair dismissal, or will they sue the agency that they're coming through? So I think there's a lot of complexities which have prevented this coming in. So it's one of those which, a bit like the enforcement body, it's good in theory, it's good in practice, but whether they can afford to bring that in and upset the economy, I'm not sure. And there's a lot of practicalities that will have to be looked and dealt through in terms of detail. I don't think this is an easy thing to implement.
Okay, thank you. Judith has asked, on the locations questions for collective consultations, does this mean in the retail sector, for instance, that all shops would need to be considered for pooling if one shop or location is to close for whatever reason?
I think it's a case of watch this space, to be honest, because on the face of what we've seen, which is pretty general, and looking at the explanatory note, that certainly could be the case. I suspect that what will happen is some unions who are involved with shop workers, particularly USDAW, people like that, might look at the nuance of this and want to actually push back slightly on it, because it might be a bit of a Pyrrhic victory here. So I think what's going to be critical is looking at what comes out once there has been some consultation on this. Again, I think this is something that is going to take a bit of time to unpick. It's not black and white, but on the face of it, potentially it could be. So it's a case of watch this space.
Emma's asked, if minimum wage has ages removed for equality, what do you think the impact will be for organisations where people are paid within a pay band? Same job, different pay rates within the specified scale. question.
If I've understood that correctly, I think you can still have scale rates within that, within bands, but what you can't deem it to be dealt with, addressed by is age. So if I've got a 17-year-old versus a 24-year-old, they can vary in the band because they'll have different skills or different experiences. But what you can't do is pay them differently on the age. So that's the key factor. It's the age distinction it'll be, and we'll need to see what that is. But it's going to be skills judged rather than age judged.
Wendy's asked, do we have visibility of changes to NLW rates for 2025?
National living wage, we don't have the detail yet. The government are actually going further in terms of looking at a GLW, which is a genuine living wage, and we're awaiting the details on that. That's not actually going to require a bill or distinctive legislation. So I think we just need to see the detail, which we might see in the first 100 days. So I would say that by October, we may see some detail on that. But at the moment, all we know that they want to go to is a genuine living wage, and how that'll be measured. They're looking to release the reins on the organisation that assesses that.
Judith's asked, flexible working. Now companies are demanding 5 days back in the office. How does this impact if everyone puts in a flexible request to work from home?
It's the same rule as far as I'm concerned, and it's quite simple. I might be oversimplifying this, but it's a first come, first serve. So for the first one or two, you will have to look, and a default proposal is the default will be it should be granted, unless you can show there's a good business reason, and you've got those 8 reasons already. But if in terms of everybody working from home, there may be a business reason as to why that is not practical, and the same approach would take effect in that you may allow 1 or 2, but actually you can't allow the whole workforce to do that. And certain jobs simply won't allow it. If you're working in manufacturing, for example, you've got to be on site to deliver that. But if you're managing, you may be able to do 1 or 2 days from home. So it will be down to the role, down to the sector, and down to the current practices.
Claire's asked to say that she's not currently unionised in her current company.
Sorry.
Are we saying that we will have to recognise a union?
No. Is a short. I saw that one popped up, so it's a good question. So to allay any fears, the answer to that is no. You will not be required to go and recognise a union at this stage. What the government is proposing is to make it easier for unions to encourage the workforce to pursue the recognition process. And so what I was trying to say is, look, you might want to start looking around at and talking to peers in your sector, so you can work out which are the good unions to work with, should that knock on the door come.
Yeah, I think what I would add to that is, from what I've seen from the guidance, what the government is trying to do is remove the 40% threshold for voting to make it easier. But again, we haven't had details around that. But as Stephen said, I would be extremely surprised if there was, an automatic right to be unionised. There'll be a lot around this. At the moment, they're simply trying to make it simpler and easier. And again, we should get more information around that.
I'll talk from practical experience as well. It's not something to be feared. I think if you're a reasonable and a good employer, then I think generally the unions can wander around and they won't significantly increase their membership, because people if they're happy with the employer and the employer's doing the right thing and actively participating with their employees, there's no need for it. It only becomes an issue if there's bad practices or it's seen to be a bad practice. And this is the difficulty with Amazon. It's a very pressurized working environment. People are not happy, and that's why they're looking to elbow their way into an organisation. But I don't think it's something to be feared. I think if you've got the right policies, the right practices and the right culture, you shouldn't get that knock on the door.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So Kim's asked, in terms of the right to switch off, how do you see this working if a business is already flexible with no specific core hours outlined?
So I think it's a case really whereby, as we've discussed, I think it's going to be a right to opt in or opt out. And I think you would have to, hopefully that it will be the case. And if you've got people who are working flexibly and who are quite happy, they're likely just to opt out of it. If you do have people who opt in, who work flexibly, and you do feel it's going to impact on how they work, then you are entitled, obviously, to have a discussion with them while they may have made a flexible working request that is has been agreed to, and obviously that is a change to their contract, that doesn't mean that you can't go back to consult with them with regards to that. Now, again, if you think you're going to have any issues with that when this comes into play, then what I would say is get early advice regarding that, and we can certainly help and support you with that. But it certainly, I think a tribunal would be very surprised if someone had two bites of the cherry and essentially ended up in a situation where they were working less. So you should be able to get assistance with that.
Again, I think to reassure those that are on the presentation is if you think of the 48-hour working week, they are not common claims.
No.
But people have opted out. It only becomes an issue if you start dismissing people and it's because they've tried to enforce a statutory right. That rarely comes up in tribunal, So I think it's one of those things that potentially is a good thing. If it's done in the right way, I don't think it'd have that much impact. It will just be one of those like we did with working time, getting people to consult, opt in or opt out, and then monitoring that to an appropriate level.
Nigel's asked, is the government also considering giving better guidance of status of employment?
I think we will get some guidance around this if we are bringing in the status of worker and self-employed. I think we will get some guidance around this. I think we will have a situation though where the courts and the tribunals will keep their position on it, which is at the moment, we're not too interested in what's written in the contract. We want to look beyond the four corners of that, what's actually happening in practice. But I think if we do have only two different types, self-employed and worker, potentially on the face of it, we could end up with less claims around employment status. But again, as Stephen said, there's a lot of issues around this. There's a lot of confusion. If you look at, say, employment, if you look at, say, umbrella companies where they're employing individuals, that's their whole model, that they employ them and they send them out on assignments. How does that work? I mean, are they employees of are they workers of the employment of the umbrella company? Will they also be workers of the end user? There's going to have to be a lot of thought around this, I think. So we should get some guidance, but I think everything will be based on the facts of the matter. And it will be really important to get guidance around that, how you're operating different models.
We've also been asked, what about changes, WRT, immigration rules and status?
I'm going to put my hand up and say I'm not an immigration lawyer, so
we're not allowed to comment on that because that's a regulated area specialist. So you'd need to go to a specialist immigration advisor on that, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Lucy's asked, is the London living wage going to be affected?
Don't know is the answer. I've not seen enough on that. I think this genuine living wage will surpass all of that, but we don't know yet.
So Kim's asked, do you think the genuine living wage will remove and or match the current real living wage, or will this be different?
I would hope that it will just be one. I think we're all torn between different acronyms and so forth. So I think the idea is that a genuine living wage will be the leading wage and will be the one that they move to.
So Wendy's asked, if our business has an employee forum in place, would this need to be removed for union interest?
I don't know the answer to that because it's not been covered, but it would. I think that would be contrary to the approach in Europe. I think if you've got a working employee forum, I think that would suffice, depending on how formal it is. But I think that will be fine. I also think you're less likely if you've got that and the workforce is happy with that forum. Again, it's a bit like the answer that I mentioned before. There should be no concern of a union knocking on the door because you've already got a forum in place.
So Darcy has asked, do you feel the opt-out system for the right to switch off would apply to roles requiring on-call work?
I think it'd be similar to the working time regulations, to be honest. And if you had individuals who were saying, who do on-call work, that's all agreed and settled, and then they said they wanted to opt out of being contacted, then obviously you've got a tension there, where if they're not going to do that, then that's going to be problematic. I also think that there will be when the guidance comes in the draft legislation, I think we will see that the government will carve out there'll be operational requirements essentially where they will say that there won't be possible to opt out, I suspect.
Yeah, we saw that with the working time regulations,
Right, exactly.
even in the transport area, and there will be exceptions as well for emergencies or unexpected eventualities that arise, and that's already in the working time regulation. So I think those will be carved out.
Similar to a couple of questions ago, I'm not sure whether you're able to answer this one. Peter's asked, are there changes expected for immigration stroke foreign workers' rights and hiring foreign nationals?
I think going by the press that's a case. I think there's I think people are torn between this issue of immigration and managing immigration versus managing the skills required for the businesses. We can't go into the details on that, because they've not been detailed themselves, but I think there's a conflict in the approaches in terms of what the governments are trying to do, and that's irrespective of the colour of the government. I think that's been a difficulty all the way through, but we'll just need to wait to see on that.
Sarah's asked, have they outlined plans to improve the tribunal service as some of these changes will increase tribunal claims?
I think this is one of the difficulties that we've got, is that ACAS, the tribunals, the courts, they're all struggling at the moment and are all creaking. I think what we are seeing and what we'll see more of is the use of technology. You've seen through lockdown how there's a lot more hearings being dealt with remotely in terms of time, costs and speed. And I think that will continue. So I think we'll see those efficiencies coming in. But those, again, there's been no detail on that, but that's the way it's already going.
So John's asked, if the living wage goes up, should all employees get a raise to reflect the gap between the salaries?
I think that's really a kind of business, kind of employee relations type point rather than a strict black and white employment law issue. And I think the argument would be, listen, if there's a living wage, that's a bare minimum that people should have. If you're getting above that, then obviously, employees are more than entitled to get that, but the two shouldn't necessarily be linked. This isn't to ensure a bare basic minimum.
Jason's asked, do you envisage any potential disability and equality reporting for equal pay for employers over 250 to follow a statutory submission process similar to gender pay?
I think that will be the basis. The short answer is yes. My concern is that I don't think the gender pay system is ideal, so I would hope that they would review that, but I think it will be along very similar lines, yes.
Danielle has asked, would you advise for employees to get ahead and look at implementing work councils if they do not have trade union recognition / collective agreements?
I don't think one will necessarily cancel out the others, to be honest, because I can't see a situation where the union will accept a fallback of, oh, we've got a works council. I think having a works council can be really helpful. It can be really instructive, and I think they're always worth considering. But I wouldn't get involved in setting one up to try and negate the involvement of unions. And just to touch on something else that Stephen said, I used to work in-house in the legal department of a large union. Very often, particularly those on the ground, the area organisers, the reps, can be really helpful to the business. They can be a conduit between the business and employees. They can often help settle matters. They can assist. They're very good often at summing up and saying to employees, listen, I think you're being a bit unreasonable. So as Stephen said, not to be feared. And I think if you are thinking of setting up a council, then absolutely, and you've got a business rationale for doing that. But I wouldn't do it simply to try and dilute any influence of the union.
I've no other questions at the moment, unless anyone else wants to pop anything in the chat. Oh, wait a minute, spoke too soon. Okay, so Louise has asked, is it right that Labour are also proposing that those with a director title could become personally liable for employment claims?
Yes, there is talk of that. Again, they're not seeing a lot of detail, but they are making them personally liable. But directors are already liable for certain elements of claims, so they may look to extend that.
So two more have just come in. Joyce has asked, for pay gap reporting, what advice would you give for employees who choose not to share information regarding disability or necessity. I didn't say that right,
Yeah.
sorry. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think you can only work with what you've got, and you have to respect if employees don't consent to that, then obviously you can't include that information. I mean, certainly what you can do is an education piece, talk about how it assists, how it can drive improvements for everyone. But, there is an opt-out, and there is an opt-out for a reason. So I think all you can do is collate the information. One thing to do though is to, once you have collated it and got consents, it wouldn't be unreasonable, say every year, to re-request consent, see if anyone is going to give their consent then. I don't think you can get the consent or the lack of consent once and not do it again. But I think it's a case of just making sure that you can show that you have tried to educate, you have tried to obtain consent reasonably. But if you're unable to do that and people opt out, then there isn't much that you can do.
I think it's the education point. I think there's often an element of fear behind people that choose not to. There may be other reasons, but sometimes it's the educational piece and explaining the benefits for all and the organisation as a whole, rather than focusing on the individual.
Okay, thank you. Samantha's asked, should we add into employment contracts about a right to join a trade union?
I wouldn't do anything at the moment. I think the thing is that even if you have something in your contract that allows someone to join a union, well, it's not really worth having because they're already entitled to join a union, and you certainly couldn't put something in saying they're not allowed to join a union. So at the moment, I would just sit tight, wait and see what happens, and just probably review the situation yourself and try and ascertain, do you think there might be appetite? Have the union already been knocking at the door? Is this something that you think genuinely they may want to push forward, or is everything pretty settled at your workplace? And as Stephen says, there hasn't really been much appetite or interest in joining a union. And then once you've worked out your kind of risk profile, so to speak, then you can work out a plan of action, and then look out for those updates as to when you're actually going to put that into play.
I think the government's proposals, although they're just generalisations at the moment, will be more than sufficient. I wouldn't touch
Yes.
contracts at all. I'd be reluctant to do that unless that's a legal
Absolutely.
requirement, even when the new regulations come in.
Okay, so Elaine's asked, given that business leaders have flagged their concerns about proposed changes that Labour will make, do you think there is anything that the government will go back on?
Only after a period of consultation, I would say, because I think, this is a big thing for them. I mean, when we're looking online at online commentary between lawyers, I mean, really the employment law stuff led the King's Speech. I mean, this is very unusual. This is a big shake up. There's obviously been some undertakings and promises given to the unions, so there would have to be, genuine evidence-based information that came out through consultation, that I think would make them roll back, and it will be linked back into growth, because that's their big thing. And if they're able to roll back, it will be based upon saying this is going to materially impact growth. So if your business feels that you do have genuine concerns about any of these proposals, when consultation comes out, then absolutely get engaged fully within that. Make sure that you do that. If there's going to be changes that you feel there won't be time to consult fully, or there's things that you want to raise now, then I would really recommend that you speak to your MPs about that and get that on the radar.
I think I would also just point to the example that we saw. If you look at the 3 or 4 weeks or the month before the election, you could see that Labour were actually trying to tread that line very delicately between keeping the unions on board. And I think the unions are keeping a very close eye on Labour at the moment. But you're also seeing the pressure from businesses, and you could see how certain policies were wavering, should we say, even before the manifesto was final, the make work pay plan came out. So I think that's a realistic thing. I think it's a push and pull, but I think the Labour are trying to keep the unions as happy as they can. But what I'd also add is, from my experience, if you look at national minimum wage, the businesses were really fearful of that. They thought that was going to lead to a massive hike in businesses closing and redundancies. It took 18 months to 2 years for Labour to bring that in 97, when it came in 98 and 99. And actually, the Conservatives, who were seen as pro-business, actually have continued that and reinforced that legislation. So there's a lot of fear And this is the importance of consultation, which is being emphasised by Labour. It's consultation all the way.
Julie's asked, is there any proposal to change the working time regulations?
There isn't, but there has been some general chat about the state of affairs we find ourselves in with regards to holiday pay, and how that's calculated, etc. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was some legislation brought in possibly to address that, but I don't think that's a main priority at the moment for the government.
That's more a result that came from Brexit. So if you remember when we were all talking about that a few years ago, working time regulations and TUPE were two of the areas we expected to see some amendments, but again, that's not been high on the agenda of the government currently. It may come up later in the term.
Judith wants to know, is there a newsletter or regular update forum that she can sign up to with you?
There's two things. If you email us on the email address info@, there's two things. We have just updated our synopsis of Labour's plans. I'm speaking to Yvonne yesterday, who's on the call, and we've marked those with a crown that are subject to the employment bill or the draft bill. We also produce a monthly update called In View, which will keep you updated with the proposals as you go along. That comes out on a monthly basis. So that's free. Just need to sign up for that. And both of those will keep you fully up to date.
Anita has asked, in an equal pay claim, can you identify more than one comparator?
Yes.
In brackets, whether sex or possible future race or disability-based claim. For example, employer having issues due to ability to identify someone specific on a like work claim that could give 3 comparators on the basis of a job evaluation scheme, in brackets, equal value claims.
That sounds like very specific. You probably need advice is what I'm going to qualify it with, but yes, you can compare yourself to more than one comparator or a hypothetical comparator.
Nicholas asked, any proposals to change the whistleblowing legislation?
There is. You'll be aware of the sexual harassment regulations, which are due to come in later this year. It's been a hot topic, I would say, for at least 2 years, if not more. And one of the areas that they're looking to introduce into to say that they'll provide protection under whistleblowing for certain people that raise the issue of sexual harassment.
That's it. There's just been a few messages about putting the email into the chat, which Jennifer and Yvonne have done now. So
okay, lovely. Joe, I know it's hard reading the questions out, so I'll thank you before we do all the thanks, but thank you for reading those out. I think some really good questions. There's a couple there that sound like they're related to specific issues. So if you don't wish to raise a specific question in the open forum, you've got Jennifer and my contact details, or if you email that email address, you can get either of us and we'll talk on a more personal note. No charge for a first half an hour if that would help. But by all means, give us a chat or contact yourselves, Joe, and you gladly forward it on, I know.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks very much, guys. I'll send out some correspondence to everyone that's signed up this afternoon for the event, and I'll put a post on LinkedIn. So if you'd like a copy of any follow-up information or a copy of the recording, then please put a comment against the LinkedIn post. Our next events start again in September. A link to sign up for these will be included in the email. There will be some information about how you can contact Vista as well in that email. If anyone is recruiting, we've also got accountancy recruit, FD recruit and exec recruit within the group. But otherwise, I'd just like to say a massive thanks to the team at Vista for your time and effort in putting the event together. It's been extremely informative, and also to everyone for signing in. Thank you.